All right, so let's pick up where we left off last class, and we were talking about our blood-brain barrier. Right, we talked a little bit about this in chapter 12 when we were going over the nervous system, but it's important that you should understand the blood-brain barrier. Any of you that are going to be involved in pharmacology of some sort, it's important to know, what substances can affect the brain. And this blood-brain barrier, its job is to determine what is able to enter into the brain's interstitial fluid. And as you know, interstitial fluid is the fluid that's found in the tissues there. And this is nervous tissue here. So the main function of the blood-brain barrier is to limit and decrease any harmful exposure to anything that could come in contact with the brain. That includes drugs, alcohol, all right, accumulation of waste products that might be circulating through your blood. All right, for whatever reason, we don't want that to infiltrate into our nervous tissue here. All right, so when we're looking at the blood-brain barrier, we are going to be dealing with our capillaries and our glial cells. All right, our capillaries, as you know, are going to be lined with endothelium. What's endothelium? They're squamous cells. And so in between the cells, these cells are connected to one another through these structures called tight junctions. Because you know that substances are going to try to pass through the cells. If they can't pass through the cells, they're going to try to go around the cells, and they're going to try to infiltrate through those tight junctions. So these tight junctions prevent anything from passing in between the cells. Well, squamous cells are epithelium. Epithelium sits on a basement membrane. Well, these capillaries have a thickened basement membrane, which is good. Helps to prevent the passage of certain materials there. And then on the outside of the capillary itself, we have our astrocytes. And they have these extensions that come off and they wrap around, all right, the capillary. We call those extensions the perivascular feet. And those perivascular feet can manipulate the positioning of these cells. And so it can make it much more difficult for things to pass through or a little bit easier. So we'll see that the blood-brain barrier is going to be all throughout, all right, our tissue there, the brain, but we'll see it reduced in certain areas, all right? Places like the choroid plexus, okay, because that's where we're going to be making our cerebral spinal fluid. In places that involve the endocrine system, like the hypothalamus and our pineal gland, right? Because they need to secrete their hormones. So we're going to see a reduction in the blood-brain barrier there because, of course, we can't block the hormones that we're trying to send out to the rest of the body. That would make no sense. So here we can see, all right, our drawing here of the blood-brain barrier. Well, actually, what am I doing? Let's zoom in over here. Let's look on the outside first. All right, so here's our glial cell, our astrocyte with its perivascular feet coming off the extensions here, and it's just covering the capillary here. Right, you can see here how the capillary is made up of all these flattened squamous cells, and in between we'll have all these tight junctions to prevent anything from passing through. And then we have our nice thickened basement membrane, and then on the outside of that, we have our perivascular feet. Okay? So there's a certain amount of protection here going on. So as we kind of take a nice cut through and look on the inside here, you can see how thick, all right, the protection layer is between your blood and the interstitial fluid here. Now, certain things can pass through easily, all right? Anything that's lipid soluble, all right, it'll diffuse right through the phospholipid membrane there, and it'll pass right through, okay? So those lipid soluble substances, no problems. Glucose, another substance. Alcohol, unfortunately, that's another substance that can diffuse through, okay? But certain things like viruses and bacteria, okay, much more difficult. All right, so it's to prevent certain pathogens and other harmful substances, certain poisons and whatnot from actually getting into your nervous tissue there. Excuse me. Wrong pipe. Okay. So what I want to do is do a quick, what I call a blitzkrieg review of your brain, of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the diencephalon. All right, so let's start off with the big part here of the brain, the cerebrum, the first region of the brain. Okay, this is where you're going to see our what we call our complex intellectual functions here. Things like higher order learning, reasoning, judgment, decision making, planning, critical thinking, right, are a couple of those things, but also, okay, voluntary motor control, taste, touch, vision, hearing, all of that is going to be located in the cerebrum here. All right, so when we're looking at the cerebrum, you notice that it has two hemispheres, a right and left cerebral hemisphere. All right, those right and left cerebral hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal fissure. In the fissure, we saw that that's where we had our cranial dural septa, which was the dura mater, and the outer layer of the cranial meninges, and it separates those two lobes physically from one another. But all right, they're not completely separated from one another because we have what's called commissural tracts. And those are tracts, all right, again, bundles of axons, all right, that will connect the hemispheres to one another. They're going to cross from the right hemisphere to the left and vice versa. And the largest one, you should know this, is the corpus callosum. It allows the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. All right, and we've learned that in certain parts of the cerebrum, all right, you'll see certain functions. For example, okay, hearing is going to be in the temporal lobe. Vision will be in the occipital lobe. You know, reasoning, thinking, personality, decision making, all that will be in the frontal lobe. All right. So the cerebrum will have multiple functions throughout specific areas of the cerebral hemispheres. For example, speech is normally going to be seen on the left side of the left cerebral hemisphere. In most people, not in everybody, but in most people. We call that cerebral lateralization. Okay, we talked about that before. Also keep in mind, and we just got done talking about this in chapter 14 when we were discussing the spinal cord and all those tracts there, right? We'll see how one cerebral hemisphere, all right, for example, the left cerebral hemisphere will control, all right, functions on the right side of the body, especially when we're dealing with motor function, and vice versa when we're talking about sensory function. If your right hand is feeling something, right, that information will ascend up into the brain but wind up in the left cerebral hemisphere, right? So we have that crossing over of signals from one side of the body to the other side of the body. Right, so we have 5 lobes in the cerebrum, okay? 4 of which you can see if you were holding a brain in your hands. You have the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital lobes, and then the invisible lobe is going to be, if you were to pry the temporal and parietal lobes away from each other, you could see the insular lobe on the inside there. All right, so our frontal lobe, okay, let's talk about the boundaries there. You need to know the posterior boundary is going to be that central sulcus. If we look at our picture here, here's the central sulcus right here. And so that's the posterior lobe to the frontal lobe. Excuse me, the posterior boundary, all right, to the frontal lobe. Well, just in front of the central sulcus is our precentral gyrus, and that's our primary motor cortex. All right, that's going to control, make sure that you've committed this to memory, voluntary movement, which means that's the area that's going to affect skeletal muscle. All right, if we go inferior down along the frontal lobe to the lateral portion, all right, we'll see, all right, one of our boundaries, the lateral sulcus, is going to separate the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. And you can see here the list of all the different functions that are found in the frontal lobe. Obviously, motor control, because we just talked about that, the precentral gyrus, concentration, verbal communication, decision-making, planning, personality, right, judgment. I mean, there's a whole list. On and on and on and on. All right, the next lobe is the parietal lobe. All right, keep in mind, if you have a good understanding of the cranial bones and where they're located on the skull, then you'll have a good understanding of where these lobes are in relation to the cerebrum. All right, so for the anterior lobe, the anterior border is going to be the central sulcus. All right, so here again, there's that central sulcus. So this is the anterior lobe, the anterior border there. Just posterior to the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus, and that is going to be where our somatosensory cortex is going to be located. If we go further back on the posterior region, we're going to come up on the occipital lobe. So the border between those two lobes, we call that the parietal occipital sulcus. And then the lateral border is going to be the lateral sulcus, which is going to be closely located to the temporal lobe there. So pretty much for consideration for the functions of the parietal lobe, you should be thinking general sensory functions. All right, touch, for example, vibration, all of that. I'm trying to think of discriminative touch, fine touch, deep touch, pressure. Those will be your general sensory functions there. Temporal lobe, right behind the ear there, right? It's going to be inferior to the lateral sulcus, hearing and smell. And then our last two lobes, the occipital lobe is going to be posterior behind the parietal lobe, and that's going to be for vision and visual memories. And then the insula, our invisible lobe or inside lobe, right, that is going to be for memory and then taste. Memory and taste. All right, so that's the cerebrum. How about the diencephalon? Here we go. Three parts of the diencephalon: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. This is internal. Okay, so if I'm holding the brain, all right, it's going to be very tough for me to see, all right, the diencephalon. It's not easily exposed here, especially when we're talking about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, here we go. So the epithalamus has two parts, the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei. The pineal gland is an endocrine gland. It secretes melatonin, and that helps to regulate your sleepiness, day-night sleep cycles, or what we call the circadian rhythm. That was going to get a little bit messed up this weekend because we are going to have daylight savings. Although I like the fall daylight savings because it's fall back and you get an extra hour of sleep. Yay. And so I'm thinking my pineal gland won't mind that too much. Okay, the habenular nuclei. This is that structure. It's a relay center here, and it's going to relay signals from the limbic system. That's the emotional system, right? Helps to generate and govern emotions. And it's going to relay signals from the limbic system to your midbrain. So it is responsible for visceral responses to odors and emotional responses to odors. A visceral response would be if you smell something and you start to salivate. That's a visceral response. Or an emotional response would be if you smell something and it puts a smile on your face, like, that smells good. Okay, there you go. That's an emotional response. Okay, the second part of the diencephalon is the thalamus. Okay, our thalamus are oval structures, and you have two. You have a right thalamus and a left thalamus, okay, depending on which side of the body, and they're connected to one another, all right, via the interthalamic adhesion. It's gray matter that connects both of those structures. Now, keep in mind, all right, when we're talking about the thalamus, where's that word? There it is, relay. Think relay center. And so we just got done talking about these different tracks, all right, these conduction pathways, and we saw that a lot of the time the thalamus was involved. And so we saw that a lot of synapsing was going on there. So if you have synapsing going on, you need cell bodies. And so therefore we need nuclei. And so that's what it is, all right? The thalamus has all these nuclei, okay, depending on what they're receiving information from, and they're going to project, okay, that information out to the appropriate region of the cerebral cortex there. So keep in mind, a specific nucleus is going to project to a particular region of the cortex. Okay, so the nucleus that projects to the auditory cortex is going to be different from the nucleus that projects to the visual cortex or the olfactory cortex. Excuse me, not olfactory, because that leads me to my next statement. Okay, this is really important because it's been seen on test questions before. All right, the thalamus is going to receive sensory information from all of our conscious senses except smell. Smell doesn't go there. Don't ask me why. It just doesn't go there. All right, here's a nice picture of the thalamus, two oval structures. They make up the lateral boundaries to your third ventricle, and in between we have a little connection between those two thalami. Okay, the last part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is located just below or inferior and somewhat anterior to the thalamus. All right, it has a physical connection to the pituitary gland, and we call that the infundibulum. Now, if you notice, if you recall, I talked a lot about the different functions of the hypothalamus. Let's quickly just go through that. Okay, it is going to control the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk about that very soon in chapter 15. Right, but that has to do with a lot of vital functions for your body: heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, respiration. I'm going to talk about this in a second here. I was going to say endocrine. All right, but anything that is pretty much going to be part of the autonomic nervous system, right? The hypothalamus has a role in that. Endocrine system, right? Production of hormones. Remember, the endocrine system is another control center. Right, the nervous system is one control center, the endocrine system is another control center. And so the hypothalamus is going to secrete hormones that is going to influence what the anterior pituitary gland does. So for example, the hypothalamus will secrete a hormone which will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete its hormone, a hormone, into the bloodstream. And so it might influence growth, for example. Right, the hypothalamus makes two hormones, the antidiuretic hormone oxytocin. And so it then ships those two hormones to the posterior portion of the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus produces the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, but the posterior pituitary gland will secrete it into the bloodstream. Often confused and mistaken, so don't make that mistake. All right, hypothalamus will help with body temperature regulation through negative feedback loops. Okay, it'll heat the body up if you get too cold, and vice versa. It will cool the body down when you get too hot. All right, also controls thirst and hunger. Okay, if you have decreased amounts of nutrients in your bloodstream, you get hungry, so you can get more nutrients. All right, if you see an increase in the concentration of dissolved substances in your blood, okay, then you get thirsty because we want to dilute that by drinking water or fluid. All right, sleep-wake cycles are influenced by the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus is going to tell the pineal gland, hey man, you need to secrete that melatonin. And then also it's involved in emotions. All right, it is part of the limbic system, and it does control some of those emotional responses. Okay, the third part or region of your brain is the brainstem. The brainstem is going to connect all three other parts, all three other regions of your brain to the spinal cord. All right, we saw how there's ascending and descending tracts. What is that? Sensory and motor tracts. We just got done going through that. We'll also see autonomic nuclei, cranial nerve nuclei, and some of the reflex centers, all right, like the cough reflex, the sneezing reflex. All right, we'll see those in the brainstem. So there's three parts: the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. You can see this nice anterior view, and then the posterior lateral view. So the midbrain, okay, I'm going to work my way down here real fast. The cerebral peduncles. Hey, we just got done talking about the direct pyramid tracts. All right, those are those motor tracts where those upper motor neurons will descend and travel down from the cerebral cortex, right, through the midbrain. Well, where do they travel through the midbrain? Right in the front, anterior lateral surface. What is that? Right here. That's this area here. These are the cerebral peduncles right here in the front. And so those are motor tracts, okay? And so it carries motor information to your skeletal muscles, voluntary motor information. Keep in mind that each part of your brainstem has its own direct line of communication to the cerebellum. So the superior cerebellar peduncles are the midbrain's direct line of communication to the cerebellum. Oh, medial lemniscus. We saw this before earlier today. Those are those ascending sensory myelinated tracts, okay, that will bring that sensory information, all right, like proprioception, vibration, all right, up to, all right, your somatosensory cortex. And so the medial lemniscus runs through the brainstem there. Substantia nigra is that darkly staining structure kind of close to the anterior portion of the midbrain, and it's dark because of the melanin that's there, all right, but it produces a very important neurotransmitter, dopamine, all right, that influences motor movement. Also, we'll see how it influences, all right, emotions, pleasure and pain responses. So when you get damage to the substantia nigra or degeneration of those cells there in the substantia nigra, and they start to decrease their dopamine production, those folks are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. All right, going further posterior in the midbrain, we'll see the tegmentum, and that tegmentum has to do with that postural motor control. All right, we were talking about this a little bit in those indirect motor tracts that we were discussing. The rubral spinal tract, all right, the red nuclei is part of that convoluted, all right, not sensory pathway, that motor pathway. And it also has to deal with, all right, postural motor control, and that's due to the reticular formation there. All right, the cerebral aqueduct is that canal that connects the third and fourth ventricles to one another, and it's surrounded by the periaqueductal gray matter, and that periaqueductal gray matter has to do with the responses to autonomic functions. We'll also see the nuclei of cranial nerve 3 and 4 located here in the midbrain. And then most posterior on the midbrain here, right, we'll see the tectum. And when we're looking at it right from the posterior view, it'll look like this kind of configuration. You'll see this kind of square looking structure with 4 bumps on it. The top 2 bumps are known as the Superiorcolliculi, and they have to they deal with visual reflexes and tracking. The inferior colliculi have to do with auditory reflexes, like someone saying, hey, what's going on? And you turn to see who it is. All right, so here we can see all those structures. We already saw that in lecture. All right, the second part of the brainstem is the pons. All right, again, with the pons, part of the brainstem, we're going to see ascending and descending tracts that are going to connect your brain and spinal cord. Then we'll see, all right, that direct line of communication between the pons and the cerebellum and the middle cerebellar peduncles, right? Our pontine respiratory center is located here. That's going to help to regulate the skeletal muscles for that smooth transition in breathing, right? And then we have our superior olivary nuclei. We'll talk more about that in chapter 16, but that has to do with sound localization. Then, of course, we have some more cranial nerves. Their nuclei are located there. Cranial nerves 5 through 8 are going to be located there. So there's our pons just in front of the fourth ventricle and the cerebellum. The last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. This is the inferior most portion of the brainstem. And then just inferior to that will be the spinal cord here. Of course, we'll see both of our sensory and motor tracts that are going to be passing through that area. That on the most anterior surface, right there in the midline, are going to be our pyramids. All right, and this has to do with those cortical sorry about that. Sometimes I love technology, sometimes I hate it. All right, let me just climb right back in there. I was kind of hoping I'd make it through without any interruptions. Why?